Chapter 8. The sun was up so high when I waked I judged it was after 8 o'clock. I lay there in the grass in the cool shade thinking about things and feeling rested and rather comfortable and satisfied. I could see the home hibbity miss nibbity. I could see the sun out one or two holes, but mostly it was big trees all about and gloomy in there amongst them. There was places on the ground where the light sifted through the leaves, and the freckled places swapped about a little, showing there was a little breeze up there. A couple squirrels sat on a limb and jabbered at me, very friendly. I was powerful lazy and comfortable. I didn't want to get up and cook breakfast. Well, I was dozing off again when I hears the deep sound of boom way up the river. I rouses up and rests my elbow and listens. Pretty soon I hears it again. I hopped up and went and looked out the hole at the leaves, and I see a bunch of smoke lying on the water a long ways up, about abreast of the ferry. And there was the ferry boat full of people floating all along down. I knowed what the matter was now. Boom! I see the white smoke squirt out the ferry side's boat. You see, they was firing a cannon over the water, trying to make my carcass come to the top. I was pretty hungry. I weren't going to do it for me to start a fire, because they might say the smoke. So I sat there and watched the cannon smoke and listened to the boom. The river was a mile wide there, and it always looks pretty on the summer morning. So I was having enough time seeing them hunt for my remainders, if I only had a bite to eat. Well, then I happened to think how they always put quicksilver in loaves of bread and float them off, because they always go right down to the drowned carcass and stop there. So I says, I'll keep a lookout, and if any of them's floating down around me, I'll give them a show. I changed to the Illinois edge of the island to see what luck I could have, and I weren't disappointed. A big double loaf come along, and I almost got it with a long stick, but my foot slipped, and she floated out further. Of course, I was where the current set in, closest to the shore. I knowed enough for that. But by and by comes along another one, and this time I won. I took out the plug and shook the little dab of quicksilver and set my teeth in. It was baker's bread, what the quality eat, none of your low-down corn pone. I got a good place amongst the leaves and sat there on a log, munching the bread and watching the ferry boat, and was very well satisfied. And then something struck me. I says, now I reckon the widow or the parson or somebody prayed this bread would find me. And here it has gone and done it. So there ain't no doubt but there was something in that thing. That is, something in it for when a body like the widow or this parson prays. But don't work for me. I reckon it don't work for just only the right kind. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke and went on watching. The ferry boat was floating with the current, and I allowed I'd have a chance to see who was on board when she come along, 'cause she would come in close, where the bread did. When she got pretty well alongside down toward me, I put out my pipe and went to where I fished out the bread and laid down behind a log on the bank in a little open place. The log forked and I could peek through. By and by she come along and she drifted in close so they could run out a plank and walk to shore. Most everybody was on the boat. Pap and Judge Thatcher, and Bessie Thatcher, Joe Harper and Tom Sawyer, Zola and Polly, Sid and Mary, and plenty more. Everybody was talking about the murderer. But the captain broke in and says, Look sharp now. The current sets closest here. Maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush and water's edge. I hope so, anyway. Well, I didn't hope so. They all crowded up and leaned over the rails nearly in my face and kept still, watching with all their might. I could see 'em first rate, but they couldn't see me. Then the captain sung out, Stand away! And the cannon let off such a blast right before me, it made me deaf with the noise and pretty near blind with the smoke. And I judged I was gone. If they'd had some bullets in it, I reckon they'd have gotten a corpse that was after. Well, see, I weren't hurt, thanks to the goodness. And the boat floated on and went out of sight around the shoulder of the island. I could hear the booming now and then, further and further off, and by, after an hour, I didn't hear it no more. The island was 3 miles long. I judged they had got the foot and was given up. But they didn't yet a while. They turned around the foot of the island and started up the channel on the Missouri side, under steam, and booming once in a while as they went. I crossed over to that other side and watched them. When they got abreast of the head of the island, they quit shooting and dropped over the Missouri shore and went home to town. I knowed I was all right now. Nobody else would come a-hunting after me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made me a nice camp in the thick woods. I made a kind of tent out of my blankets to put my things under so the rain couldn't catch 'em. Then I catched a catfish and hauled him open with my saw. And towards sundown I started my campfire and had supper. Then I set out some line to catch some fish for breakfast. When it was dark, I sat by my campfire smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. But by and by I got sort of lonesome, and so I went and sat on the bank and listened to the current washing along, and counted the stars and the drift logs and the rafts that come down. And then I went to bed. There ain't no better way to put in time when you're lonesome. You can't stay so soon you get over it. And so, for 3 days and nights, no difference, just the same thing. But the next day I went exploring around down through the island. I was boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say. I wanted to know all about it, but mainly I wanted to put in the time. Found plenty of strawberries, ripe and prime, and green summer grapes, and green raspberries, and the green blackberries that was just beginning to show. They would all come in handy by and by, I judged. Well, I went to fooling along in the deep woods till I judged I weren't far from the foot of the island. I had my gun along, but I hadn't shot nothing for protection. I thought I would kill some game come high noon. About this time, I mighty near stepped on a good-sized snake, and it went sliding off through the grass and flowers, and I after it, trying to get a shot at it. I clipped along, but all of a sudden, I bounded right up into the ashes of a campfire that was still smoking. My heart jumped up amongst my lungs. I never waited for it to look further, but uncorked my gun and went to sneaking back to my tiptoes as fast as I ever could. Every now and then I stopped amongst the thick leaves and listened for a second. But my breath come so hard I couldn't hear nothing else. I slunk along another piece further, then listened again, and so on and so on. If I see a stump, I took it for a man. If I trod on a stick and broke it, it made me feel like a person had cut one of my breaths in two, and I only got half, and the short half, too. When I got to camp, I weren't feeling very brash. There weren't much sand in my craw, but I says, this ain't no time to be fooling around. So I got all my traps into my canoe again, so as to have them out of sight, and I put out the fire and scattered the ashes around to look like an old last year's camp, and then I clumb a tree. I was reckon I was up in the tree for 2 hours, but I didn't see nothing. I didn't hear nothing. I only thought I heard and seen things as much as 1,000 times. Well, couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I got down. But I kept in the thick woods and on the lookout all the time. All I could get to eat was berries, and what was left over from breakfast. By the time it was night, I was pretty hungry. So when it was good and dark, I slid out from the shore before moonrise and paddled over to the Illinois bank, about 1/4 of a mile. I went out to the woods and cooked a supper. Then I had made up my mind. I would stay here all night. And that's when I hear a plunkety-plunk, plunkety-plunk. And I says to myself, horses coming. The next I hear people's voices. Well, I got into that canoe as quick as I could and then went creeping through the woods to see what I could find out. I hadn't got far when I hear a man say, we better camp here if we can find a good place. The horses is about beat out. Let's look around. I didn't wait. I shoved out and paddled away easy. I tied up in the old place and reckoned I would sleep in the canoe. I didn't sleep much. Couldn't, somehow, for thinking. And every time I waked up, I thought somebody had me by the neck. So the sleep didn't do me no good. And by I says to myself, I can't live this way. I'm going to find out who it is that's here on the island with me. I'll find out or bust. Well, I felt better right off. So I took my paddle and slid out from the shore just a step or two. And then I let the canoe drop along amongst the shadows. The moon was shining, and the outside of the shadows made it look as light as day. I poked along well into an hour, everything still as rocks, sound asleep. Well, by this time, I was most down to the foot of the island. A little ripply, cool breeze had begun to blow, and that was as good as saying the night was about done. I gave her a turn with the paddle and brung her nose to shore, and then I got my gun and slipped out and into the edge of the woods. I sat down there on a log and looked out through the leaves. I seen the moon go off watch and the darkness begin to blanket the river. But in a little while, I see a pale streak over the treetops, and I know day was coming. So I took my gun and slipped off towards where I'd run across that campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. But I had no luck somehow. I couldn't seem to find the place. But by and by, I catched a glimpse of fire away through the trees, and I went for it, cautious and slow. And by I was close enough to have a look. There laid a man on the ground. It most give me the fantods. He had a blanket around his head, and his head was nearly in the fire. I sat there behind a clump of bushes about 6 foot from him, kept my eyes on him steady. It was getting gray daylight now. Pretty soon he gaped and stretched himself and hove off the blanket. And it was Miss Watson's Jim. I bet I was glad to see him. I says, "Hello, Jim," and skipped out. He bounced up and stared me up wild. Then he drops down on his knees and he puts his hands together and he says, "Don't hurt me. Don't. I ain't having none done no harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people, and I done all I could for 'em. You go and get in the river again, where it belongs, and don't do nothing to old Jim. And I was always a good friend of yourn." Well, I wasn't wrong in making him understand I weren't dead. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I weren't lonesome now. I told him I weren't afraid of him telling people where I was. I talked along, but he only sat there and looked at me and said nothing. And then I says, "It's good daylight. Let's get breakfast. Make up your campfire good." And he says, "What's the use of making up the campfire to cook strawberries and such? You got a gun, ain't you? Can we get something better than strawberries?" "Strawberries and such truck?" I says. "Is that what you live on?" "I couldn't get nothing else," he says. "Why, how long you been on the island, Jim?" "I come here the night after you were killed." "What, all the time?" "Yes, indeed." "And you ain't had nothing to eat but that kind of rubbish?" "No, sir, nothing else." "Well, you must be most starved, ain't you?" "I reckon I could eat a hoss." "I think I could." "How long you been on this island?" "Since the night I got killed." "No, why, you was lived on? But you got a gun." "Oh, yes, you got a gun. That's good. Now you kill something and I'll make it up on the fire." So we went over to where the canoe was, and while he built a fire in a grassy open place amongst the trees, I fetched meal and bacon and coffee, and the coffee pot and the frying pan, and sugar and tin cups. And the nigger was set back considerable, because he reckoned it was all done with witchcraft. I catched a big old catfish, too, and Jim cleaned him with his knife and fried him. When breakfast was ready, we lolled in the grass and ate it smoking hot. Jim laid it in with all of his might, for he was most about starved. And when we had got pretty well stuffed, we laid off and lazied. By and by, Jim says, "Well, looky here, Huck. Who was it that was killed in that shanty if it weren't you?" Then I told him the whole thing, and he said it was smart. He said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Then I says, "How come you done to be here, Jim? How'd you get here?" He looked pretty uneasy, didn't say nothing for about a minute, and then he says, "Maybe I better not tell." "Why, Jim?" "Well, there's reasons. But you wouldn't tell on me if I was to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I run off." "Jim. But mind, you said you wouldn't tell. You said you wouldn't tell, Huck." "Well, I did. I said I would, and I'll stick to it. But honest Injun, Jim, I'll stick to it. People call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum, but that don't make no difference. I ain't gonna tell, and I ain't gonna go back there. Anyways. So now, let's know all about it. Well, you see it this way. Old that Miss Watson, she picks on me all the time and treats me pretty tough. But she always said she wouldn't sell me down to New Orleans. But I noticed there was a nigger trader round the place considerable lately, and I get to be going on easy. Well, one night I creeps in the door pretty late, and I don't want quite shut, but I do hear the old missus, and she tell the widow she gonna sell me down to Orleans. She didn't want to, but she got $800 for me. And I was such a big sack of money, she couldn't resist. The widow, she tried to get her to say she wouldn't do it, but I never was ready to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. I tucked down out and shin down the hill and expect to steal a skiff along the shore somewhere above town. But there was people that get stirring in it, and so I hid in the old tumble-down copper shop on the bank to wait for everybody to go away. Well, I was there all night. There was somebody around all the time. About 6 in the morning, skiffs began to go by. About 8 or 9, every skiff that went by was talking about how your pap had come over to town to say he was killed. The last skiffs was full of ladies and gentlemen going over to see the place. Sometimes they'd pull up in this shed, and then before they started out across, they'd be looking about and talking about for me. And they got to talk about how maybe I'd done the killing. I was powerful silly you were killed, but Huck, I didn't kill you, and I ain't sorry no more. I laid there in the shavings all day, and I was hungry, but I weren't feared. 'Cause I know the old missus and the widow was going to start up the camping meeting right after breakfast and be gone all day. And they knows I goes off with the cattle about daylight, so they wouldn't expect to see me around the place. So they wouldn't miss me till after dark in the evening. The other servants wouldn't miss me, 'cause they'd be shitting out to take a holiday as soon as the old folks out with the way. Well, then when it come dark, I tuck up at the river road and went about 2 miles or more to what there were no houses, and I'd made up my mind about what I was going to do. You see, if I kept on trying to get away afoot, the dogs, they'd track me, and if I stole a skiff to cross, they'd miss the skiff. You see, and then they'd know about how I land on the other side and what to pick up my track. So I says the raft is what I'd after. And that don't make no track. And I see a light coming around the plain by and by, so I wade in and me shove off a log ahead of me. So I swum more than half a mile across the river and got in amongst the driftwood, and I kept my head down low and kind of swum again under the current till the raft come along, and I swum on the stern of it and a little tuck hold, and it clouded up, and it was pretty dark for a little while, so I clumb up and lay down on the planks. The men was all the way yonder in the middle, but where the lanterns was. The river was rising good, and there was a good current, so I reckon at about 4 in the morning I'd be 25 miles down the river, and I'd just slip in just before daylight and swim ashore, and take it to the woods on the Illinois side. But I didn't have no luck. When we was most down to the dead end of the island there, man come after looking at the lantern. I seen there weren't no use to wait, so I slid overboard and struck out for the island. Well, I had a notion I could lay most anywheres, but I couldn't. The bank was too bluff. And I was almost on the foot of the island before I found a good place. I went into the woods, and I judged I wouldn't fool with no rabs no more, long as they moving the lanterns running around. I had my pipe in the plug, a dog leg, and some matches in my tin cup, and damn, it weren't wet. So I was all right. And you ain't had no meat nor bread to eat all this time? Why didn't you get mud turkles? Now how am I going to get 'em? You can't sleep up on 'em and grab 'em. How's a body going to get 'em in a rut? How could a body do it in the night? I won't give myself on the bank in the daytime. Well, that's so. You had to keep to the woods all the time, of course. Did you hear 'em shooting the cannon? Oh, yes. I know they was after you. And I see 'em go by on the hills. I watch 'em under the bushes. some young birds come along, flying a yard to a time and lighting, and Jim said it was a sign it was going to rain. He said it was a sign when young chickens flew that way, and so he reckoned it was about the same when young birds done too. And I was going to catch some of them, but Jim, he wouldn't let me. He said it was death. He said his father laid mighty sick once, and some of them catched a bird, and his old granny said his father would die. And he did die. And Jim said you mustn't count the things you were going to cook for dinner because that would bring bad luck. Same if you shook the tablecloth after sundown. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died, the bees must be told about it before sunup the next morning, or else the bees would... Well then, how about that? Well, that interruption was brought to you by a spam caller. But it seems like a good time to pause and say, I'm not entirely comfortable with trying to read Jim's dialect. I don't figure there's any way I can do it without it sounding terrible and hard to pronounce. And that's because Mark Twain, pretty much wrote it phonetically. So I'm here trying to suss out what he's trying to say. And there's no way to say it without it coming across like Jar Jar Binks. And I gotta say, that makes me uncomfortable. But reading this real time, there's no other way for me to do it. So I'm trying to be respectful, and I'm trying to respect both the literature and the culture. And it seems hollow to say I don't mean any harm by it, but I don't. If it's bothersome to you, please feel free to stop listening. It is bothersome to me, but I'm going to keep going. So, where were we? All right, yes, the bees. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died before... Apparently I wasn't ready. And he said if a man owned a beehive and that man died, the bees must be told about it before sunup next morning, or else the bees would all weaken and quit work and die. Jim said bees wouldn't sting idiots, but I didn't believe that, because I had tried them lots of times, and they wouldn't sting me. I had heard about some of these things before, but not all of them. Jim knowed all kinds of signs. He said he knowed most everything. I said it looked to me like all the signs was about bad luck. So I asked him if there weren't any signs about good luck. And he says, mighty few. And they ain't no use to a body. Well, you want to know when good luck's coming for? Keep it off? And he said, if you's got a hairy arms and a hairy breast, it's a good sign that you's going to be rich. And while there's some use in a sign like that, in case it's so fur ahead. But, you see, maybe you's got to play pole a long time first. And so you don't get discouraged and kill yourself if you didn't know that the sign was going to be that you'd be rich by and by. Have you got hairy arms and a hairy breast, Jim? What's the use of asking that question? Don't you see I has? Well, are you rich? No. But I've been rich once. I'm going to be rich again. Once I had $14. But I tuck out to speculating and got busted out. What did you speculate in, Jim? Well, first I tackled stock. What kind of stock? Why, livestock. Cattle, you know. I put $10 in a cow. But I ain't going to ask no one else to risk up no money for no stock, 'cause the cow up and died on my hands. So you lost the $10? No, I didn't lose it all. I only lost about 9. I sold the hide to a tanner for $1.10. So you had $5.10 left. Did you speculate any more? Yes. You know that one-legged nigger that belongs to old Mr. Bandish? Well, he started up the bank, and he said anybody that put in for $1 would get $4 most in the year. Well, all the niggers went in, but they didn't have much. I was the only one that had that much. So I stuck out for more than $4. And I said if I didn't get rich, I'd start a bank myself. Of course, that nigger, he wanted to keep me out for the old business. Because he says there weren't business enough for 2 banks. So he said I could put in my $5 and he'd pay me $35 at the end of the year. So I done it. Then I reckon I'd invested $35 right off then and keep things a-moving. There was a nigger named Bob that had catched a wood flat, and his master didn't know it. And I bought it off of him and told him to take the $35 when they come near the year come. But somebody stole the wood flat the next night. The next day, a one-legged nigger said the bank's busted. They didn't have none of us get no money. What did you do with the 10 cents, Jim? Well, I was going to spend it, but I had a dream. The dream told me I'd give it to a nigger named Balaam. Balaam's ass. They call him Balaam for short. He's one of them cuckleheads, you know? But he's lucky, they say. And I seen I weren't lucky. The dreams say Balaam invested 10 cents and he'd make a raise for me. Well, Balaam, he took the money, and when he was in the church, he hear the preacher say that whoever give it to the poor and to the Lord, and about to get his money back 100 times. So Balaam, he took and give the 10 cents to the poor and laid low to see who would come of it. Excuse me. Well, what did come of it, Jim? Nothing ever come of it. I couldn't manage to collect that money no way. And Balaam, he couldn't. And I ain't going to lend out no more money. Dad, I see that sign of security. But I'd give your money back 100 times. That's what the preacher says. If I could get the 10 cents back, I'd call it square. And I'd just be glad for the chance. Well, it's all right anyway, Jim, as long as you're going to be rich again, sometime or the other. Yes, and I was rich now, come to think of it. I owns myself. And I'm worth $800. I wish they had the money. But then I wouldn't own me.